Hello, welcome to Faith Matters. I'm the Most Reverend Bennett D.D. Burke, Bishop of the Liberal Catholic Diocese of Arizona. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about faith and spirituality from a progressive point of view. If you're looking for that old-time religion, well, the Liberal Catholic Church does offer the traditional sacramental form of worship, but we combine it with the widest measure of intellectual liberty and respect for the individual conscience. You can learn more about us online at www.azlcc.org, including where to find one of our places of worship. Today we have with us Jason Cianciotto, Executive Director of Wingspan, Southern Arizona's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered community center. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Glad to have you on Faith Matters today. Jason, let's start by talking a little bit about your journey to your current position at Wingspan and how you first started with Wingspan quite a few years ago.
I did. In fact, it was January of 1995. I left my home at the time in western New Jersey and took a 3-day road trip and moved to Tucson, Arizona to live with my father and his wife, my brother and sister, who offered me a safe and welcoming place to come to set up home, to go to school, after a very difficult adolescence growing up with my mother and her husband in a Southern Baptist evangelical Christian household. And they ultimately could not accept me as being gay. But when I got here, I still really hadn't quite settled on who I was. And my first day in Tucson, we went to Caruso's restaurant on 4th Avenue to celebrate my arrival. And at the time, Wingspan was in a little storefront location right on 4th Avenue, and they had a big glowing pink triangle in the storefront. And I knew enough about the LGBT community to know that that was a sign, a symbol of safety, of welcoming. Right. And I nervously looked at my father and I said, well, it makes it obvious what that place is about, or something like that. And probably a couple of days later, I went down to the avenue and kind of peeked my head through the door, and it was a Wingspan volunteer who smiled at me and welcomed me in and asked me, who I was, and when they found out that I was in the age range of the youth group, I was 19 at the time, told me about the Saturday morning youth group, which had been really the cornerstone of Wingspan service to the community since its inception. Okay. And I started attending the youth group and finally came out to myself and to the world on Valentine's Day of 1995.
Ah, great. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And then after that, what happened next in your life?
Well, almost immediately, Wingspan introduced me to the notion of how being open and honest and sharing my personal story and my life could not only help to prevent other young people from experiencing what I did, but could also be a source of healing for me. I think the youth group facilitator at the time sort of saw that, whether it was a need that I had and then maybe an ability or interest, and volunteered me to go on a show on, I think it was Channel 9 or Channel 4, a half-hour Sunday, one-episode talk show with one of the anchors called Tolerance in Tucson. Okay. And it was a panel of youth representing different racial and ethnic minority groups, talking about what it's like to live in Tucson as who they are. Okay. And that sparked in me a desire to continue moving forward with that. And I never really thought of working in the movement as a career until I was awarded a scholarship, a youth scholarship from Wingspan, to go to the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force's annual Creating Change Conference. Oh, okay. It's the largest annual gathering of LGBT activists, straight allies, and I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we basically took over this big, beautiful old hotel, and I was amazed to look around me and see that there was actually a national movement of people whose goal was to achieve equality and safety and well-being and freedom for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And that's when I decided that was what I was meant to do in life, and it wouldn't have happened if not for Wingspan.
That's great. What were you planning on doing? Did you have some ideas before that?
Well, I was kind of floundering at the U of A, you know, from biological sciences,
Okay.
psychology, sociology. But
Okay.
what I learned, with the opportunity that going to a college like the U of A provided to me, was to get a real broad-based education and see that I was most interested in what determined human behavior,
Okay.
and then in the social structures around that influenced human behavior and the way people interact with each other in ways they don't even know about. And that's how I ended up focusing on public policy and ultimately getting my master's degree in public administration.
Okay.
And at the time, I thought I wanted to pursue equality from a legal standpoint and go to law school.
Right.
But that didn't work out, and I ended up focusing more and more on laws and policies. How do things like immigration reform specifically impact LGBT immigrants? What about social welfare reform? And I started, becoming more cognizant of the intersections of racism and homophobia and transphobia and discrimination based on gender, and ended up pursuing a career as a public policy analyst, but on gay issues.
Okay.
And at the time, there was only one place you could go to do that, and that was back at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, who houses a policy institute.
Okay.
And so I was fortunate in the summer of 2003, after I graduated, to move back to New York City,
Okay.
sort of go back to my first home, and start working for one of the two major national gay rights organizations.
Wonderful. Now, what did you work on? I mean, what particular kinds of things were the focus of your efforts at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force?
Well, a fascinating story about my first week at the task force, because it really colored what happened. In the first week, I ended my first week there going to a rally in the park in Greenwich Village at Christopher Street, sort of the heart of, right next to the Stonewall Bar where the Stonewall riots took place in 1969, and saw a lot of my sort of personal heroes in the movement celebrating the Supreme Court's Lawrence v. Texas ruling. That was the ruling that struck down laws that made intimacy between people of the same sex illegal. And this had been something that they had been struggling for over 3 decades. And it was so inspiring to see them up there, some with tears in their eyes at this incredible milestone. So they had reached sort of the end of a decades-long journey, and I was just beginning my journey.
Right.
But as we saw almost immediately with another important court ruling, this one in Massachusetts that produced a demand for marriage equality in that state, my journey was going to be characterized by focusing on really this movement for relationship recognition that most of the LGBT community, at least those involved in movement organizations, did not choose for themselves.
Right.
And it's been a really fascinating journey along the way to first at the national level watch as all these states, like eventually Arizona this year, passed anti-marriage ballot measures, and to try to, from a national organization at a skyscraper in close to Wall Street in Manhattan, figure out how to influence, how to affect our movement.
Right.
And that experience taught me a really important lesson. I would refer to it as sort of my Dorothy Gale moment. If you recall in The Wizard of Oz, at the very end, Dorothy and the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, they're talking to the wizard, and he's asking them all what they've learned about their journey, and he gets to Dorothy.
I know this line, and I love it.
Yeah, and she says, I've learned that the next time I go looking for my heart's desire, I'm going to look no further than my own backyard. And it gives me chills to say that and think about it, because that was one of the big things that I took home from my journey from Tucson, which had really become my home. It became, it was a place that let me become who I was, let me put the pieces of my life back together. It is my home.
In a welcoming place.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now I've come back because I know that the way I think to truly make an impact, to truly make a difference, is to focus on the local communities. Wingspan made that difference for me when I was a teenager, and I'm so grateful to be back doing it again.
Well, that's a wonderful story, Jason. Thank you for sharing that. Starting out with Wingspan, changing your life for the better, and now you have the opportunity to help lead Wingspan forward.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, what are some of the things, tell our viewers a little bit about what Wingspan does. We've talked a little bit. I named it Southern
Sure.
Arizona's Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center. But what does that mean? What does Wingspan provide? What does Wingspan do? What do people find when they come to Wingspan?
Well, Wingspan began 20 years ago as simply a safe space for young people to go to become comfortable with who they are, to connect to community resources, and to really find a place of safety. It was just a few years, a decade or so earlier, that there was a horrific hate crime here in Tucson, and that resulted in, and now of course I'm forgetting the name offhand, and someone being killed in front of a bar called, ironically, the Stonewall. And that's what really created the movement here in Tucson. It created the Tucson Observer, the weekly gay newspaper that exists today, and it sparked the creation, Richard Heekin.
Okay,
That's his
there
name.
we go.
So from that youth group, Wingspan eventually added on a anti-violence program, thanks to the wonderful volunteerism and activism of a woman named Lavina Tomer, who had been a victim of same-sex domestic violence, and found that none of the organizations in the Tucson area could really understood what her situation was like as a lesbian, and could provide safe and comfortable services for her because of discrimination and homophobia. And so, like the spirit of Tucson, she started her own organization, and Wingspan sheltered it and became the Wingspan Domestic Violence Project. Today it's called the Wingspan Anti-Violence Programs. And along with still providing a 24-hour crisis line, walk-in counseling, referrals to shelters and other services, also helps victims of hate crimes and employment discrimination.
Okay. Because previously, if I'm remembering my history of some of this well, domestic violence protection wouldn't have been seen by police officers or courts or judges the same way with same-sex people.
Yes.
They wouldn't have gotten the same consideration or the same help or treatment.
Sure. Unfortunately, even today we find that victims of a wide variety of crime who may identify as LGBT are less likely to report them to the police out of fear of discrimination for who they are. And so Wingspan serves a vital role, again, in saying we are a safe place for you to come to. We are a welcoming space.
Great, great.
You know, at the core of Wingspan is the community center itself, a physical location, a physical home. Today we have a library, a free lending library with over 5,000 titles that people can borrow for free. We have a public access computer lab that people can use, and we provide free space for over 40 groups and organizations that meet at the center a month. From a variety of 12-step support groups to other community organizations like PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, who can come and meet there again in the safe space. It also houses our information and referral service. People can go online and search for thousands of businesses and organizations and people who provide services on our website, or call and get them from a front desk volunteer and know that this is a business or an organization that will provide services to them in a friendly and accepting way.
Great. Well, I'm going to do a shameless plug here for a minute,
Sure.
Jason, because the Liberal Catholic Church has donated some books to that library,
Yes.
and it is a great library. And we are one of the organizations that takes advantage of that meeting space. And on the second Tuesday of each month, we offer a support group called Come Again, Recovering from Spiritual Malpractice and Abuse, so that we can help people who identify as people of faith but have struggled to find acceptance within their faith tradition.
Yes.
A place to come and talk openly and confidentially with others who share similar experiences. So it is a wonderful place to meet and truly a safe place. So it's great that Wingspan can offer that.
Good. Well, and thank you for, we wouldn't be able to provide services to the community if you and other groups didn't come in and make use of those services and make them available. So
Great.
thank you.
You're welcome. You and I had lunch a couple of months ago, and we talked about some of the things about your vision for Wingspan. I'd like to have you talk a little bit about where you see Wingspan going under your leadership with your
Sure.
great staff. A couple of things you and I talked about at lunch were adding more of the spiritual focus that I think, correct me if I'm misquoting you, but I think you said something like you've got the mind and the body part covered pretty well, but not quite as strong in the spirit.
Right.
Not necessarily meaning Christianity in other words, a very welcoming and inclusive and broad-based approach. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what your vision is for adding that spiritual component to some of the Wingspan offerings.
You know, I was fortunate when the Wingspan board and staff gave me this opportunity to come back home and become executive director, that I see it as my job to carry out the mission and vision of the organization as they have defined it, as the community has defined it. You know, so our mission is to promote the freedom, equality, safety, and well-being of LGBT people. And as you pointed out, we have a number of programs that affect mind and body. Some things that I didn't mention earlier were the Southern Arizona Gender Alliance, which came together as a merger of two different organizations working together to provide a wide variety of services to the transgender community, and our health and wellness program arm, which does everything from tobacco cessation programs just for LGBT people to bringing in financial experts running a business or those for LGBT, helping our families understand how to manage their financial well-being in this time of economic crisis. So you can see that we do offer such a breadth of programs that address physical health, mind, you know, body, mental health, mind, but we're really missing a lot on that spirit, and not only in my own life, but in the lives of many of the people that I interact with on a daily basis at Wingspan. I see that often the root of I think that pain that a lot of people feel who have been ostracized and excluded in society, who have been said you don't fit in because you don't fit a mold, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Often the root of that sadly comes from the spiritual component of their lives. You know, in my case, I was kicked out of my church when I was 16 years old, and have never really worked through what my spirituality is. I was at a conference once where the Reverend Bishop Yvette Flunders, who runs a wonderful social service organization and church out in San Francisco, was the keynote speaker. And she was addressing an audience of activists. And she said, you know, sometimes I think that all of you gay activists have replaced God with activism in your lives. And, you know, and I sat there and my eyes started welling up with tears, and I realized that, you know, wow, I pursue my career and the work that I do with the same sense of heart and fervor that I once gave to the faith that I was raised in. And I sort of took that and connected it to something else. And I think for our community to be whole and for Wingspan to fulfill its mission, to promote the well-being of people spiritually, to promote the freedom of religious expression and worship, regardless of how you identify, we need to reconnect people to that spiritual component in their lives.
Well, that's great, Jason. We're going to help you on that on Faith Matters, because we're going to be interviewing a lot of people from a lot of diverse faith traditions that are welcoming and inclusive over the course of our series. So we'll, and in fact, we're going to have you back, and we're going to have you talk more about that issue in depth, as well as some other advocacy issues that you're working on.
Thank you.
In the few minutes we have left, tell us a little bit more about what you see as the vision for Wingspan now that you're executive director. Where do you want to see the organization go?
Well, it's hard to talk about having a vision as a steward of the organization without talking about the economic context that we've been placed in. And like a lot of nonprofits, particularly those who provide government-funded social services to the community, we're going to see cuts in funding. So I think that my job now has changed dramatically from what I thought it was going to be when I started on April 15th of 2008, which is to help guide and shepherd under the guidance and advisement and collaboration with our staff and our volunteers and the other community partners that we have, to guide and shepherd this organization through this difficult economic time, so that when we come out on the end of this, when this recession is over, at its core, Wingspan is still providing those services that have been the root of its dedication to the community, making sure that folks across the lifespan, from youth to seniors, have that safe place, have that home to go to. And I was reminded of that the other day. I worked a volunteer shift at the front desk. And in the just 1 hour that I was able to give to that, I took 3 phone calls. One was from someone who wanted information about transgender issues and about transitioning, and I referred them to Saga. Then we had a walk-in of a youth who had never been in a gay and lesbian community center before, and I was able to give him information about our Eon youth program.
Oh, great.
And then another was just a basic information and referral call about a particular bar and nightclub in town that they could go to. And sometimes it's easy for me in my office on the second floor to get lost in the administration and management, but that moment, that hour rooted me in what is it that Wingspan really does.
It does what it did for you.
Yes, and that is what my vision is, to keep
Great.
that going, to do it stronger, to do it better, and to build a foundation for the next 20 years of Wingspan service to the community.
Great. Well, I think that's a great focus, because I've heard a lot of organizations similarly talking about that need to shepherd their organizations through the tough times.
Yeah.
To maybe back off for a little while on some of the new programs or new ideas and stick to the core. I remember Tom Peters, who's a business consultant, and I read a lot of his books years ago, and he calls it stick to the knitting.
Right.
Figure out what it is you're good at and make sure you're always providing that core of the things that you and your organization are best at doing. So clearly, that's one of the things, a safe place to go.
Yeah.
And I've spent a lot of time at Wingspan myself in my various ministry activities and some other reasons for being there, and it is a wonderful, welcoming and safe place. It's interesting because when I first started showing up at Wingspan a few years ago, and for various reasons, but dressed in this clerical outfit, I have to say I got a lot of funny looks from people.
Who is that guy?
Yeah,
What's
who's
he
that
doing
guy
in
and
here?
why is he here? Because it's kind of a sad commentary that a lot of folks in the LGBT community are suspicious of someone who is dressed in clerical attire, imagining that there's some kind of agenda that might not be something they're looking for. But I'm very pleased to say that most people there now know me and recognize me when I walk in and greet me warmly, and recognize that there's a lot of work for all of us to do in the faith communities as well as at Wingspan and in the wider LGBT community.
Sure.
For welcoming acceptance both directions.
Right. And I think it's vital that you're doing that in your formal clothing, because part of that healing is just getting used to this notion of getting this, particularly when it comes to Christianity, getting this idea out of our heads that sexual orientation and gender identity are exclusive from Christianity, and simply just your physical presence in dressed this way is what helps open the door for people.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because that's very much how I've thought of it myself. And I've said to people, I've actually been questioned by people who say, well, if you just dress in civilian clothes, you wouldn't look as intimidating. I say, it's interesting, because when I was a child, I looked at people who wore these things with respect and as people I could generally turn to.
Right.
I want that to come back for people who may not have had that reaction to the symbol that this provides, but as you say, to recognize that not everyone who represents Christianity is coming from a place of exclusion.
Right.
Many of us are coming from a place of welcoming and inclusion.
Right, and you represent an institution as well.
Correct.
It's not just an individual who happens to be a sort of outlier among clergy. You, as part of the liberal Catholic Church, are representing an organization that has congregations around the country that is welcoming, and a lot of LGBT people don't even realize that exists, because all we see on television are the faith traditions and congregations who exclude us. Right,
very true. And in fact, again, very similar to what you just said, Jason, I have people come up to me once in a while and say, I don't subscribe to your particular view of faith, and I don't really have any interest in coming to your worship services, but I'm really glad you're here. And that does feel good, that validation that people feel, as you say, from an organization that does represent, I don't like to use the word authority, but an organization that validates from another perspective that people truly should be welcome for who they are and included in all aspects of society. Just as there's a movement in the military, I've heard some good interviews recently on the radio with some military leaders who were saying, we can't afford not to use the talents and skills of our LGBT members, because it's hard enough to get people to do these difficult jobs. We need everybody to do the jobs that need to be done. And I think all of society we hope someday will see it the same.
I agree.
Good. Well, that's great. So we're going to have you back on another episode,
Great,
so that
thank
we can
you.
explore in more depth some of the issues that we've touched on today, and we'll talk more next time about advocacy on some very particular issues, gay marriage issues,
Sure.
faith issues, and some more of the things that will be, once you get Wingspan, once you and your staff shepherd Wingspan through the storm, the economic storm, to continue to work for that inclusion, that acceptance, that welcoming, and all the different ways. So as you said before, you got in on the end of one movement
Right.
when you began this, but now there's fresh and very important issues to continue to tackle.
Well, and in the struggle that we're facing, there's the opportunity.
That's a great way to look at it. I collect quotations, and I have a file of them, and that's one almost exactly like that. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity,
Right.
and I do like to work with people that have that approach, that approach to looking at life. That another one that I enjoy very much: be thankful for problems. If they were less difficult, someone with less ability would have your job. And I like to think that each of us has some skills and talents that we bring, and we are in the right place at the right time, because we hope we are equal to those challenges. And it sounds like your